So I got my hands on the X21 and this is the first phone from Vivo that I spent more than 2 hours with. But this is an interesting one, so interesting that I thought of making this video. So it's kind of an impressions video, but it's more of a 5 things before buying, if at all you're buying or considering to buy the X21. Should be fun. So thing number 1, the in-display fingerprint sensor. This is the flagship feature of the X21 and it's not the first time we have seen this, but it's the first time it's available to the masses. And there is a lot to talk about this. So the basic mechanism behind this is the Synaptics sensor present right under the display. So whenever you rest your finger on that fingerprint icon, the display illuminates it so that the sensor could see the reflection of your finger through the display glass, match it up with the stored value, and eventually decide whether to unlock the phone or not. It's not a big sensor, hence it does not cover a large surface area like 2/5 or half of the screen, something like the Apex concept phone from Vivo did. That would be way more expensive. But this is fine too. There is always that fingerprint icon to guide you to the correct place. But at the end of the day, it's not a great speed. It's quick, but not when you compare it to any other fingerprint sensor. It's almost comparable to the speed of the first generation Touch ID on iPhone 5s, SE and 6. Setting it up itself takes up a good couple of minutes. Oh, and also you have to put some pressure every time you tap the sensor, which is scary, but then just like the first generation Touch ID, this too is the first generation of its kind. And it's likely to become just as fast, if not faster than the present sensors. Oh, and speaking of fast, there is also Face Unlock, which is super quick to set up and also probably the fastest that I've seen. You don't get a glimpse of the lock screen. Thing number 2, the hardware. So this is actually pretty nice hardware on the outside, like almost every other smartphone since a couple of years now. But it's also a very basic, not too flashy design, which is the way I like things to be. So now it's got a clear glass back with no cutout for the fingerprint sensor, making things minimal. The glass back, however, is fairly reflective, although not as much as the one on the OnePlus 6, which also highlights much more fingerprints than this one. But also just like the OnePlus 6, the X21 too has that design by Vivo branding at the bottom in the same font. I mean, after all, they are sister companies. There is also a very tiny vertical camera module that actually protrudes, but not by much. Although the one thing that I didn't understand about the design was that since it now has an in-display fingerprint sensor, why does it have a notch? Think about it. But speaking of the notch, the best part of the design was actually the display. So it's got the same 6.3 inches of display size like the OnePlus 6, along with a notch and along with a tiny bottom bezel. But the display on this one is more spread out towards the edges than any other phone that I've seen with a similar design. It's almost as if they are touching the edges, which is super cool. And in fact, when you compare it with the OnePlus 6, which is very similar to this one in pretty much every area, the difference is noticeable. They both have the same sized notch, which is pretty tiny, and the same sized chin, which is also one of the slimmest I've seen. But the overall footprint of the Vivo is actually smaller than the OnePlus 6, which is really fascinating. And it's mainly got to do with the edge-to-edge bright and colorful 1080p screen on the X21. Speaking of colorful, let's talk about the software. So firstly, it thankfully runs on Oreo and not Nougat, but then this being a Vivo has got a very heavy skin on top of it, which I hate to say, but it's one of the best ripoffs of iOS. I mean, I really think it will please all those people who have that wannabe iOS themed launcher on their Androids. So if you swipe down on this one, you get a search bar. And there's no lag, by the way. If you swipe up from the bottom, you get a control center for all those quick actions. But this one's from the old iOS versions, so hopefully future software updates will make it resemble to the present iOS 11 one. Just saying. But nonetheless, it feels pretty smooth, but obviously nothing beats stock or Oxygen OS, at least for me. Next up, the camera. So it's got a 12 megapixel primary camera and a 5 megapixel secondary camera to assist in those portrait shots, along with an app which is also a ripoff of the iPhone app. But in the app there is this aperture bar that as you slide changes the f-stop value. But it's not really changing the actual aperture size because this does not have a variable aperture lens like the Galaxy S9. So changing the value of aperture is basically to give you a pro vibe while using the phone. It does not alter the amount of light entering the sensor. Instead, this bar is used to alter the amount of blur you want to have in your portrait shots. I tried it and it's just average. But the image quality, although I could not see, I've heard is pretty similar to that of the OnePlus 6, which by the way I'll be covering in depth in a couple of weeks, so press that notification bell. Now last but not the least is the price. So I realized I haven't spoken about its specifications at all. So it's got 6GB of RAM, a Snapdragon 660 along with a 3300 mAh battery, and it's priced at 36K, which is more than the OnePlus 6. Now if I were you, I would surely get the OnePlus. I mean, even though they are boring as hell, but I'm a fan of their user experience, mainly because of Oxygen OS and Dash Charge. Plus, I also think that the X21 is not really worth it. It's not got the best hardware on the inside, the skin is not really worth it, and the in-display fingerprint sensor, although it's pretty remarkable, but as of now, at least in the X21, it does not make a difference. I hope that makes sense. So that's a quick look at the Vivo X21. My favorite feature is actually not the in-display fingerprint sensor, but the display spreading more towards the edges. That for me is pretty intense. With that being said, I gotta thank a bunch of people for helping me make this video. Sarthak and especially Bimansak for being my hand models and also supporting throughout the shoot. Oh, and also to Dhananjay for lending me his unit to form the opinions and make this video. I'll leave their channels linked below, and I'll talk to you in my next one. Take care.